Welcome. This will be our first discussion on the topic of Chapter 1. This is from the book. This is the third edition. Now, if you're using an older version or edition 2, they're very similar. They had to rearrange the chapters to make you buy the book that's new, but you can follow along if you're using the second version of the book. If you would just make sure you check the arrangement of the chapters, and pretty much the content is similar between the two, but my slides will go with chapter 3, and the section for that is we're going to be covering, should be coming up here in a second. There we go. It'll be chapter 1, pages 2 through 35 in the book, and the topics is the introduction to microbes, which is very appropriate for being a microbiology class, and the building blocks. And I think it's really important. I think you've had a lot of the biochemistry and biology 111 or other courses, but online you can see that we break it down by week, and June we already started, I guess, yesterday on the 2nd when we began, and today is the 3rd at the time of the recording, and Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and if you look, next week will be week 2. We are going to be cramming a lot. I'll be doing the lectures every week asynchronously, so that you can listen to these whenever you like, and that's how it usually works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss this in sections, and so that you don't have to sit and listen to me drone on for the entire chapter. So we're going to start with tiny but mighty, what I like to call it, they didn't ask me, lean, mean fighting machines. And that's really what bacteria are. And let's get started. So we're going to look at the various different types of microorganisms, the role and impact that they have. Believe it or not, the microbes really reduce the environment. So if you want to talk about living organisms that have changed the environment over millions and millions of years, bacteria have done this. And in fact, the oxygen that we breathe is ultimately from the growth of the bacteria, but the plants and the trees and all those things contributed. But it's the player of everything. It's not just one. Explain the theory of evolution, and we're going to talk about that, and then how we can manipulate these organisms for our own uses. And this is a biotechnology. It's a very exciting area. I say biotechnology, I would say nanotechnology these days. That's where it's really, really going on. Now we're going to also talk about the burden of human disease. And one of the things I'm going to talk about and try to convince you is that microorganisms a primary role in life is not to make you sick. Is if you provide a niche and they're able to grow in it, then that's your problem. The organism isn't set out to do that. That's something I've sort of learned over the years. It's the way I kind of look at it. So our job is not to become lunch for these microorganisms. We're going to talk about how we differentiate among bacteria, and talk about how we identify acellular infection agents like viruses, compare and contrast the relative sizes of microorganisms. So these are the sorts of things that we're going to talk about. So microbiology is a specialized area. It's my favorite area of biology that deals with living things that we really need a microscope to see. And these can be broken down to bacteria, archaea, protozoa, fungi, helminths, viruses, and algae. And so one of the points I just make really quick, probably won't say it again, but fungi, not fungi. Fungi is somebody you invite to a party. Fungi is the way we really want to say that. And again, vocabulary and how we pronunciate the terms are really important. The last thing you want to do is put the emphasis on the wrong syllable, and everyone in the lab or wherever you're at going to say, so we don't want to do that. So I try to point out the proper enunciation as we go along. Okay, so microbes are very easy and very difficult to study because of the size and the technologies that we have at the time when we study it. They reproduce rapidly. They can grow as fast as they can double every 15 minutes or so, depending on the organism. They can be grown in large populations. I've usually feed billions and billions of microbes at a time, and I beat McDonald's hands down every time. Cannot be seen directly, of course. I have to use a microscope, and I really want to emphasize the microscope as best I can for this course. Granted, you don't have one at home. If you do, that's great. If you don't, that's fine. I'm going to show you the best I can to the virtual world. Analyzed through indirect means. In other words, we kind of can draw our conclusions based on the technology that we use to study it. And of course, viewed through my favorite device, a microscope. So microbes have shaped the development of the earth. For billions of years, the single-cell organisms appeared on the planet about 3.8 billion years ago. Now, I wasn't there. I know that you might find that hard to believe, but 3.8 billion years. Now, if you look in the scope of things, we're kind of a young planet compared to other stars in the universe, as far as we know. But still, that's a long time. So, 3 cell types arose from a single type of common ancestor, and we have names for a lot of these. So in groups, the eukaryotes are true nucleus type of organisms. These are your higher level. We have bacteria, which are single-celled, and because of the terminology, we don't say that they have a true nucleus. What they have is a circular chromosome, and that's usually what I refer to it. The archaea are really not of a particular interest of mine because, well, they don't cause really much, if any, human disease. And so if that's the case, I'm not really interested. You know, as someone would say, boring, but that's just me. Single cell, no true nucleus, and they're distinct from bacteria. They are archaic. In other words, they're old, and it's one way to remember that. And here's a crappy slide showing the relatedness of organisms. We have the bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, and you can see the groups broken down. And the bacteria are very diverse. Green non-sulfur bacteria, believe it or not, microorganisms, as we'll find out, can be used for bioremediation. In other words, we can break down oil and substances like that. There are microbes that can actually break down radioactive nucleotides or nuclids that into non-toxic type of forms of radiation, which is kind of new that we discovered. Bacteria, don't say it's new, it's just something we have discovered that they can do. They never cease to amaze me what they can do. So we have cyanobacteria, because some of these can actually photosynthesize and utilize the sun for their energy sources and the like. It's of course, that was sort of how it brought down and reduced the environment for the earth as early versions of things. And they all broke from the earlier common ancestor, aquifex and things like that. But the archaea, you can see, is sort of a branch of the eukarya. So as they fit on the scheme of things, the bacteria seem to be of their own ancestry, and the archaea are closer to the eukarya, in other words, higher forms of life. And the eukarya, of course, we know about the animals, slime molds, and various things that you may or may not have come across. Bacteria and archaea are predominantly single-celled, as we know. Eukaryotes, many are single-celled, develop in highly complex multicellular organisms, they have cubicles or little organelles that's really unique. They have these compartments. They're usually larger, and they're a smaller minority, higher organized as compared to bacteria and archaea. I can't say how many microorganisms like bacteria there are out there in terms of comparing it to eukaryotes. It's just, it leaves them in the dust. I mean, it's just wow. The evolutionary timeline, you can see the probable origin of the Earth, and then you start looking at, and they don't really know, of course. They can just go by data carbon, just going through the looking at the age of C4, C3, the carbon dating. Bacteria, archaea, eukaryotes, you can see insects, reptiles, mammals, and humans. And so the humans are showing up kind of late at the scene here, but anyhow, it is what it is. Microbes are ubiquitous, and they're found deep in the Earth's crust. They can be found in ice caps in the oceans, inside bodies of plants and animals, the Earth's landscape, and they're essential to life. Well, we also found, NASA, well, we don't usually mention these things, but they found that microorganisms, when they're manipulated in space and true with the environment of space, bacteria become more pathogenic. In other words, they can cause disease better in those environments than they can on the planet and Earth. So I don't know what that means, and what that just don't travel in space too much, I guess, and your infections won't be as bad. Just a tip from your Uncle Ed there. Also, we find that the microorganisms, at least we think, we found evidence of them fossilized in what appeared to be meteorites at one time, and some claim that they could see the microorganisms that were in those. So maybe panspermia, in other words, bacteria are ubiquitous throughout the universe. It's not my theory, but it's a theory that's out there, and life is sort of seeded everywhere based on sort of the dirty space environment, and we get bombarded constantly with meteors and various other things. Maybe that's where the sources of things come from. Hey, maybe a UFO flew over and dumped their toilet, and here we are. I don't know. We'll just keep that amongst ourselves here. So the theory of evolution is the accumulation of changes that occur. Now, I'll just make a comment about evolution, and it comes down to DNA, which all of life seems to have DNA, and we haven't found an exception to the rule. And the DNA always seems to be the A's and T's, G's and C's, and we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. But if DNA was perfect every time when it replicated, it would be, of course, 100% replication. And it's not. We see that there are errors introduced. Now, if that didn't occur, there would be no evolution. It is a culmination of mutations and changes in that DNA that drive the evolution. And that's sort of course, that's just looking at, well, what's different? Well, the DNA is different, and that's what drives the evolution. We know that this occurs on all forms of life. Of course, that's everywhere, and we can test that. So the theory is a theory until it's disproven, sort of, like all the central dogma theory that the DNA to RNA to a protein is, well, we've seen a few exceptions like HIV virus, which has reverse transcriptase that can take RNA to DNA, but that's an exception. So the central dogma theory still stands until it's disproven, so that's why we have the theories. So theories have undergone years and years of testing and have not been disproven. Well-studied, well-established natural phenomena. So we still refer to them as theories until they're disproven, so they stand. So when you hear the word, well, this is the current beliefs, it always leaves room for you to try to disprove it. if you're interested in research. But the theory is not just a random guess or a gut feel. It's based on science. Photosynthesis. This is very interesting. If you've studied this in Biology 111 or 110 or whatever course, the idea behind that is we have photosynthesis is the sun essentially cracking water, and that means that it breaks the oxygen from the hydrogen, and it becomes a highly reactive molecule, and that is what the hydrogen portion of it is split, and it sort of forms a battery effect across the membrane, driving ATP synthase, and that makes the ATP. And the ATP now is what fuels all of life in terms of doing things. It's a chemical bond energy form that is very reactive, and we'll talk about that. But ATP is universal. It's sort of like MasterCard is accepted in all places. It's important. It's universal, and of course, when we crack water, we get the hydrogen, which forms and charges the batteries across that membrane, and that spins the ATP synthase that makes the ATP, and we'll talk about that. But also as released of that is oxygen, because of course when you crack the water, H2O, oxygen is released, and so that's photosynthesis. Now, there are aoxygenic photosynthesis occurred in bacteria before plants evolved, and it didn't produce oxygen, and it was more efficient in fact of extracting the energy from sunlight. And then oxygenic photosynthesis evolved from the ones that didn't, and these are responsible for 70% of the Earth's photosynthesis. So very interesting. I can't explain it. I don't know why that is. But maybe someday we'll find out what's going on about that. Microorganisms are the main forces that drive the structure and content of soil, water, and atmosphere. Microbes produce CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane or methane if you're from Britain or someplace, that insulate the Earth's atmosphere. And so that serves as sort of a blanket, the greenhouse effect, some might say. Microorganisms are the most abundant cellular organisms in the oceans. I can't tell you how many viruses and bacteria and all sorts. It's a soup. Viruses are the most abundant inhabitants of the oceans, and we'll talk about the viruses to some great detail on chapter 6, I believe it is. Bacteria and fungi live in close associations with plants, assist them in obtaining nutrients and water, and protect them against disease. So Microbes and Humans uses bread production, alcohol production, which of course Louis Pasteur, we're going to talk about, a very famous microbiologist, one of my heroes. Sir Isaac Newton is one. Louis Pasteur was very interesting. You get a chance to read the history of some of these really famous people. Louis Pasteur was a very interesting person, and he funded a lot of his research because he figured out the yeast and purifying the yeast, and he actually started microbreweries. Now, they didn't call them that in those days, but he actually funded his research by selling beers, and beer of various different types. That's a very interesting man. If you get a chance to study some of the people behind this, Louis would be a good one. Cheese production, everyone loves cheese, especially my dog. You may see him from time to time. He comes in and visits me while I'm talking, and I might even get him to say hi to you. A treatment of wounds and lesions, and we'll talk about that in more detail, of course. Mining precious metals. Oh, this is an interesting one. It is very interesting how these microorganisms can concentrate certain types of metals. Now, there's one I'm going to talk about that's really, really important in medicine, and that's iron. When you talk about the battles and you come down to the ultimate identification of what it's all about, it's the fighting for the amount of iron is one of them. Robert Brubaker, Dr. Brubaker, has studied disease. One of my favorite scientists of modern day. He did a lot of work on looking at iron and what they call acquiring iron. Let's just leave it at that. And it comes down to the battle, because that is what charges transfer RNAs. And tRNAs are very, very important, as we know, in building proteins ultimately. And doing the translation, that is the universal translators to transfer RNAs. And it comes down to certain things. You know, in humans, believe it or not, if you've traveled and followed the points where they travel, and where the key points, one was salt, and it was finding salt. You had to have salt. If you didn't have salt, bad things happen to you. So it all comes down to searching these things, and we'll talk about that. And then bioremediation, I've already mentioned, is cleaning up human created contamination. You know, you look at the disgusting, we're slobs, right? I mean, let's just be honest. You look in the ocean, we have plastics of all certain kinds just floating out there, just miles and miles of this stuff. Trash, just junk. And now we're finding microorganisms that can bioremediate the plastics. And I'm really excited about that, because it shows that we can be smart and slobs at the same time. And maybe we can feed some of these microorganisms some of the junk and things that we throw away, and clean things up a little bit. And so biotechnology is a really huge area. I remember being at the boon of that back in the 70s. I know it dates myself. I mean, let's be honest. We've got students taking this course that I have socks older than you are, but that's okay. I mean, you know, I'm an old guy, and yes. Genetic engineering manipulates the genetics of microbes, plants, and animals for the purpose of creating new products and genetically modified organisms. Genetic engineering is amazing. I mean, gene jockeys using restriction enzymes, it kind of drove that. We'll talk about what a restriction enzyme is, but it was from the bacteria. Bacteria produce certain enzymes, not always just bacteria, but a large part of them. And these EcoR1 is a restriction enzyme, and it cuts DNA at a very specific site. And that is what we use for the engineering in the early days, to cut DNA, and then we could bring it back, to piece them together, and gene jockeys could put different inserts and make recombinant DNA by using the restriction enzymes and then a DNA ligase to bring it all back together. And that's kind of the origins of recombinant DNA technology. And then bacteria, we can manipulate genes and have the bacteria pass them along through conjugation or transduction. We'll talk about those sorts of things. But the one that is really interesting, as I've already mentioned, is bioremediation. And that's cleaning up toxic pollutants and various things. I think that's an exciting area of microbiology. Vast majority of microorganisms are harmless and beneficial. So I always like to look at the dark side of being a microbiologist in human health. And again, my philosophy is that these microorganisms acquire certain characteristics that allow them or enable them to grow in our system, our bodies. And so for our practical purposes, we'll call those pathogens, because that's, if they cause the disease, then we know that they're pathogens. And the idea, though, to be consistent with my philosophy, is that because they can grow in a particular niche, if that happens to be you, then so be it. And so if we understand that. So we have about 2,000 different microbes that cause disease. Now, believe me, there's a lot more than that we don't know about, and maybe I don't want to know about, but they're going to be there. The 10 billion infections occur across the world every year. Well, I mean, you got to put a number on it. I would imagine that fluctuates from time to time, and that's the business that we're in. I mean, of course, we're trying to offset those infections by drugs and various antibiotics, which are useless for the most part right now. So infectious diseases are among the most common causes of death worldwide. Now, cancers and all sorts of things. I'm going to stop for a second and say one of my biggest things that I've very, very interested in are probiotics. I've worked for companies that exclusively do probiotic type of work. I'm biased in that. I think the microorganisms our gut are key, very key for our health and survivability. I take probiotics, and I think it helps break down certain foods and nutrients, but it really is a guard in our gut. It keeps us from leaky gut types of things, and we'll talk more about that. If you're interested in probiotics and want to do a extra credit project on probiotics, I would highly recommend that you do that and look into them if you don't know what they are. We'll talk more about that later on, but I just thought I'd bring that up. So if you look at the top causes of death, we have heart disease, cancer, chronic lower respiratory diseases, which I'm not going to be bringing up too much of the COVID-19 stuff. Be honest with you, I'm sick and tired of it. It's just one of those things that, I studied it when I was in school. There's a particular cat version of the coronavirus, and I was interested in it at the time, and because we had to study various things, and that's one of them I chose. And here we are again. It's revisiting the coronavirus and up close and personal. Accidents, isn't that interesting? The cause of death, accidents. And if you look at the number of accidents and deaths by respiratory diseases, so I guess walking out in traffic is just as bad as smoking. I don't know. The strokes, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, influenza, and pneumonia, kidney disease, and suicide. They're all factors in life. And really, all of those things you're going to see if you're in nursing, or you're going to go up the chain and become maybe a nurse practitioner or a doctor. What you think you are going to do may be just a moment in your career, and you'll grow, which you'll find out when you go through school. We never stop learning. We always learn more and more and more. And that's a good thing. That's what is exciting. I would be really upset if I say, well, I know everything and therefore, no, And if you find that I've made a mistake or said something wrong, I will not take it personal. Please bring it up. And I kind of rely on my students to keep me honest. In fact, I'll tell you really quick. I gave a lecture once, and it was at school, and I noticed the students were, nodding off and sleeping, and, my voice, I guess, isn't the most exciting, voice in the world, I guess, I don't know. But anyhow, I started talking about pigs flying backwards and paint, and no one stopped me. I couldn't believe it. They just were kind of droning in, and those things I don't like. And I just want to make sure that students, hey, Dr. V, what are you talking about? Pink pigs flying backwards. What's that all about? And so the point was being is that you got to stay on your toes with me because I can be annoying at times. So microbes and disease, emerging and re-emerging diseases. Oh, aren't they just wonderful? AIDS, hepatitis C, Zika virus, West Nile virus, tuberculosis. We can go on and on about Lyme disease. That's one of my pet peeves is Lyme disease, Borrelia burgdorferi, and maybe 6 or 7 other organisms. And I'm working on a new case study right now that I think you'll find really, really interesting if I can finish it this semester. And case studies are really, really useful. They give you an application of a particular disease like hepatitis or something, and there is one in unit chapter 11, which comes in this week. There's a case study, and it's flesh-eating bacteria. I think you'll enjoy it. I mean, it's in a sick way. I don't know, but it's interesting, these microorganisms that live. So that fits under the emerging and re-emerging diseases. Some of these pathogens can be really, really nasty. And the case studies help us tear this apart and examine an example. And I'm thinking about bringing up a CDC type of case study that we can talk about and refer to. It's a single study on tuberculosis, or it's a combination of things. And I may refer to that case study throughout the entire course. And that way it kind of sews everything we talk about together as we go along. and I'm going to try it out on you. Yes, you're going to be my guinea pigs. And I think, though, it'll help bring lab and class and everything together. See how that goes. So, association between non-infectious diseases and microbes. Gastric ulcers are caused by Helicobacter pylori. Oh my gosh. I could tell you stories about Helicobacter pylori and how it was identified. I mean, the scientist who was behind that was essentially tarred and feathered and run out of town. And it turns out that Helicobacter pylori can grow in a very low pH environment, and actually, in some ways, can be good. It can prevent GERD and other bad things, but you can treat it easily with tetracycline. But don't tell the pharmaceutical companies, because they want to sell those medications that prevent ulcers to you. Multiple sclerosis, OCD, coronary heart disease, obesity have all been linked with chronic infections with microbes. Oddly enough, it very well could be not having the right bacteria in your gut. So probiotics, you know, there's some papers that are supporting the theory that I've held for a long time, that we can stay some of these things if we have the right bacteria in our gut. So one of the places that we're going to be studying a lot from is the CDC. This cuts across lots of fields, lots of areas, and I view it as an authority for us to refer to various diseases. And what's really important is that it's a free resource, and I'm going to show you by the end of the semester how to use the CDC resource. And the CDC is important from the standpoint that we can get our statistics, we can understand various aspects of disease based on records that have been kept. Is really important and valid resource. So I'm going to show you how there's a project we're going to have where you can go and collect statistics and find out. It's totally free. It's just you got to know how to do it, and I'm going to show you it's easy. And at any time you want to know the prevalence of a disease, because look, you're not going to know what's coming through that door when you're working in hospitals and various things, and it's up to you to make sure you're ready for your own protection of what types of diseases may be coming your way and through the door. CDC is a great resource for that, and understanding the trends and increasing number of patients with weakened immune defenses or defenses in general. This is sort of common. We're looking at diabetes and various things that really cut at the base of life. And if we can't distribute energy properly, and that's diabetes is a disease in moving energy, I guess, across membranes, it really boils it down. And then that causes a weakness across the board. If you can't fund things, in other words, you know, they say money makes the world go around. Well, ATP, or the energy, and being able to shuttle that for various cells, if you can't do that, then they start to break down, and then we get feet amputated and things like that as a result of diabetes and things. So unfortunately, we start to see other infections. And then, of course, the big thing that we also will stress, that resistance to antibiotics is across the board. There is no antibiotic right now, none that can stop every infection. There's some organism that's resistant, and more becoming resistant all the time. It's a huge health threat. I'll give you another example in another area. Fungi. You know, the fungi are they've learned how to grow. They're sort of like the tortoise and the hare. The hare being the normal bacteria. The tortoise are slow, but the fungi will grow and grow and grow. They may not be fast, but they'll grow. And then there's certain drugs that we use to stop it. And what we're finding out, even in the fungi world, that we're seeing resistance to miconazole and things like that we've used for years and years and years, no longer being effective. And that's a pretty scary thought, because fungi, they can be really nasty. In fact, they think that guys, Girls, you don't have to listen to this part, but guys, your prostate cancer is probably ultimately, if we do everything right, ultimately we'll succumb to that. And they think it might be a fungal infection that's producing all sorts of waste products that lead to the prostate cancer. So when that first discovery came out, miconazole containing products flew off the shelves. And I'm not going to go into how they applied it or whatever, but the idea is that we understand more and more how microorganisms can be responsible for various different types of diseases like cancer and various things, and that's why I'm really interested in the microorganisms and probiotics. Eukaryotics, eukaryotes are organelles, membrane-bound structures that perform specific functions. You know, the nuclei, the mitochondria, the chloroplast. And the mitochondria, by the way, and chloroplast used to be bacteria. They have the same sort of cellular structure. We'll talk about that. But isn't that interesting that somewhere along the line we've had these organizations that they stop and they form these I don't know, little groups that get together and decide on, okay, we're gonna hit a deal with the eukaryotes and we'll become part of them and all that sort of thing. So some microorganisms, some are macroscopic, so they could be rather large because they organize with multiples. And so bacteria and archaea are usually loners. They're boring, 10 times smaller. They lack organelles, but do not feel like, well, because they're less sophisticated. They're not. In fact, there are certain things like ATP synthase, and we'll go over that. That is a very sophisticated nanostructure. It spins with almost zero resistance, makes ATP, and fueled by hydrogen, which is essentially a battery effect. Hydrogen, what? Positive charge. And what spins the ATP ACE is the hydrogen, that momentary attraction to the positive charge. Believe it or not, it's amazing. Bacteria do that. It has the same sort of structures and everything that the eukaryotes do. So it's sort of like living in a camper versus a huge home. They're mobile. They can do pretty much everything, but they don't have all the sophistication and overhead that the eukaryotes have. So which one's stupid and smart? Thinking about weirdness. Viruses. I always like these. Not independent living things. Are they alive? Are they dead? Well, look. If I can use Clorox and kill back the viruses off a toilet seat, let's say, they were alive, right? They just don't reproduce like bacteria and other forms of life. They're actually pirates, and they take over the cell. And you think about it, it's really infectious nucleic acids, because viruses have either DNA or RNA, never both, and they're infectious, so they have a way of moving it with this proteinaceous sort of covering, which you provide, by the way. But yeah, it's more like a spaceship where the nucleic acids are moving from one place to another. It's really kind of scary if you think of it that way. They're inert outside the host. They're very specific. And viruses have been with us since the beginning of time. Bacteria are not immune. They also have viruses. They're called bacteriophages. Very interesting. And we'll talk about bacteriophage. How many have heard about CRISPR? CRISPR is the new DNA technology that we're all excited about in terms of doing recombinant DNA and that sort of thing. Well, really, CRISPR is the immune system of bacteria that we've known about and now can manipulate DNA with. So bacteria have learned how to try to deal with these bacteriophages and the attacks by these viruses by creating this CRISPR type of environment. And we'll talk about that. So I just thought I'd bring that up. So they exist as a form of genetic material that confers a partial genetic program inside the host. In other words, they run this as they take over you. They bring their own programming, and it's sort of like they say viruses and computers. and they can be really nasty, and they can cause cancer and do all sorts of things, and we're going to talk about that in chapter 6. So we have 6 types of microorganisms, and you can see the relative size because I mentioned I was going to talk about that. Viruses, archaea, protozoa, fungi, various things, and you can look at the size relationships. The viruses are pretty small. You look at the red blood cell, kind of looking at about the same bacteria, and the fungus is, we're on about the same order. Now they vary. Bacteria can be really, we're going to have to work really hard to look at bacteria like staph or strep under a microscope because that really pushes the resolution power. But we'll talk about that. So next time we're going to come back and we'll talk about section 1.2, and that'll be the microbes in history, which is should be something of interest to you. So I guess I've taken enough of your time today on this part, and we'll pick up and talk about microbes in history starting next time, and see you then.